Or university students lost their lives inside a house while they were sleeping, and to this day no one has managed to understand what was really going through the mind of the man accused of ending their lives. Some believe it all began as a silent obsession within a cold and twisted mind that studied the crime for years until turning it into reality. But the most unsettling part of this story is not just the violence of the attack, but that after so many investigations, hearings, and evidence, the perpetrator never explained why he did it.
He only left terror, destroyed families, and a life sentence wrapped in chilling silence. If you want to know all the details, stay until the end.
The case of Brian Koberger. Every day we live with evil. We witness the darkest side of human behavior. The suffering caused by one individual to others is something latent in our society. In Criminal Investigators, we will delve into that dark side of humanity. We will bring the most perverse crimes to the screen and try to enter the minds of those beings who commit the most terrible acts. I am Mario, and today I bring you another case. But before we start, I want you to tell me where you are watching us from. We really like to know how far these stories reach. Also, don't forget to leave your like and share this video if you think someone else might be interested. And now, let's begin. In the early hours of Sunday, November 13th, 2022, the tranquility of the university city of Moscow, Idaho was shattered by a crime that would shock the entire United States. Inside a student house located on King Road, 6 young people were sleeping after having spent a normal Saturday night. In the middle of the night, Dylan Mortensen woke up to various noises coming from inside the house. He heard doors opening, footsteps, and voices that seemed strange to him. At some point, he thought he heard one of his roommates talking about the presence of an intruder inside the house. Although uneasy, she tried to convince herself that it was probably normal movements among the residents and visitors. Shortly after, Dylan heard what she thought was crying coming from Zana Kernodle's room. She also heard a man's voice saying something like everything was fine. Alarmed, she opened her bedroom door again and then saw a figure dressed in black walking towards the kitchen exit. The person was wearing a mask covering the mouth and nose. There was brief eye contact before the man left the house through the sliding glass door. Dylan was paralyzed with fear. Later, she would remember that the individual was tall, with an athletic build, and had particularly bushy eyebrows. Terrified and confused, she immediately closed the door and stayed locked in her room while trying to contact her roommates, receiving no response from anyone except Bethany Fonke. Hours later, around noon, Dylan and Bethany asked some friends for help to check the house. One of the young men approached Zana's room and discovered a horrifying scene. He immediately asked for the emergency number to be called and for no one else to enter the house. At 11:56 in the morning, emergency services received a desperate call reporting that something terrible had happened inside the residence. When the police entered the residence, they found the lifeless bodies of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Zana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. All had been attacked with a bladed weapon in a scene that left even the most experienced investigators shocked. Outside the house, sirens, patrol cars, and ambulances began to fill the streets as the horror started to spread throughout the university community. As the hours passed, the scene became the center of an investigation that quickly captured national attention. The police cordoned off the entire area while detectives and experts worked inside the house, trying to understand how such a massacre had occurred without anyone stopping the attacker. The autopsies revealed that the 4 victims had multiple wounds caused by a sharp object. The investigators concluded that most had been attacked while sleeping or in conditions of great vulnerability. Additionally, at least one of the victims had defensive wounds, indicating that they tried to resist the attacker before dying. They were also able to confirm that none of them showed signs of sexual assault. Dylan, Bethany, and the friends who came to help that morning were questioned and later ruled out as suspects. Meanwhile, fear began to grip the university town. The idea that an attacker had entered a house full of students during the early morning and then disappeared without leaving clear traces caused a total sense of insecurity. Many students temporarily left the campus, and numerous families were demanding immediate answers from the authorities. Amid the shock, tributes for the victims began to multiply. Flowers, candles, photographs, and messages appeared in front of the house as friends and family tried to process a tragedy that seemed impossible to understand. But while the community mourned the 4 young people who had died, investigators still did not have a clear suspect, and the perpetrator remained at large. Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Izana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin were students at the University of Idaho and led a typical college student life. They shared friendships, gatherings, and future plans within a student community where everyone seemed to know each other. Kaylee, 21 years old, had grown up surrounded by her family's love and maintained a very close relationship with her loved ones. Although she had already moved out of the King Road house by November 2022, she continued to visit her friends constantly, especially Madison, her best friend. They had been inseparable for years. Madison was also 21 years old and studied marketing. Her acquaintances described her as a calm, kind, and very sociable young woman. On the night of November 12th, she went out with Kaylee to a local bar before returning to sleep at the student residence. Zana, 20 years old, was also studying marketing and was in a romantic relationship with Ethan, who was studying recreation, sports, and tourism management. The couple had attended a university party that night before returning to the house where Zana lived with her roommates. The house was spread over 3 floors and was known for the constant coming and going of friends and students. Dylan and Bethany also lived there. For all of them, that night seemed like just another one in the university routine, gatherings, outings, and plans for the upcoming end-of-year holidays. As the hours passed, the investigators also began to reconstruct how the victim's night had unfolded. Kaylee and Madison had been at a local bar. Ethan and Zana, for their part, attended a university party before returning to the house. Nothing in their activities seemed to indicate that they were being followed, or that there was an evident threat against them. The autopsies confirmed that Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan had received multiple wounds to the upper body and chest. The investigators determined that the injuries were caused by a large bladed weapon, possibly a combat knife. Meanwhile, the university community remained completely paralyzed by fear. The police still did not have an identified suspect and could not ensure whether the attacker had acted specifically against the victims or if the target was the house itself. Amid the investigation, detectives found a key element at the crime scene: a leather sheath belonging to a military knife. The object was found near the bodies of Kaylee and Madison. Although the murder weapon did not appear, that finding quickly became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the case. As the days went by, the FBI formally joined the investigation, and phone lines and emails were set up to receive information from the public. Thousands of people began sending tips, recordings, and reports related to suspicious movements that occurred during the early morning of the attacks. Among all those tips, one began to stand out above the rest. An employee of a nearby gas station reviewed security cameras and found footage of a white Hyundai Elantra repeatedly driving around the area of the house during the time window when the crimes occurred. Shortly after, other cameras captured the same vehicle leaving Moscow at high speed heading towards the state of Washington. Although the finding seemed promising, there was a huge problem. In the region, there were thousands of similar vehicles. The investigators knew that the car could be a key piece in solving the case, but they still needed to find out who was behind the wheel that early morning. As the search for the white Hyundai progressed, the investigators continued working on the knife sheath found at the scene. The specialists managed to recover DNA from the object, although they still did not have an identity to compare it with. Meanwhile, public pressure on the authorities was increasing every day. The police continued to receive thousands of calls and emails with possible leads. In a press conference, the authorities revealed that they were even investigating reports about a possible stalker related to one of the victims, although nothing had been confirmed at the moment. Shortly after, an agent reported that a white Hyundai Elantra registered in Pennsylvania matched the characteristics of the vehicle sought by the investigators. The car belonged to Brian Koberger. Additionally, a neighbor stated that the young man had been seen meticulously cleaning the interior and exterior of his car using gloves a few days after the events. Meanwhile, investigators obtained genetic material from the trash at the Koberger family home in Pennsylvania. When they compared that DNA with the one recovered from the sheath found next to the bodies, they obtained a chilling match. After weeks without public answers, the authorities finally believed they had found the main suspect in the quadruple crime in Idaho. We will pause for a moment to learn about this man who fortuitously came to light in the investigations of the crimes of those 4 university students. Brian Christopher Koberger was born on November 21, 1994 in Pennsylvania, and grew up in an apparently stable family with his parents and sisters. Both his mother and father worked at the same school he attended during his childhood. While Michael was in charge of the maintenance of the establishment, Marian worked helping students with special needs and behavioral problems. During his early years, Brian faced constant teasing related to his weight. He was a reserved young man, with difficulties socializing and few close friends. Over time, those who knew him began to notice intense and strange behaviors in his way of relating, especially with women. Several girls used to reject him, and some classmates described his gaze as unsettling. In adolescence, he began using illegal substances with one of his closest friends. However, after finishing high school, he returned completely changed. He had lost a lot of weight, appeared more self-confident, and had a much more aggressive and confrontational attitude than before. After leaving a technical institute, Brian found some stability working as a security guard while studying psychology at the university. Later, he also trained in forensic investigation and excelled academically. By 2022, he moved to Washington with the intention of obtaining a doctorate in criminology. Although he seemed successful academically, his personal problems continued. Brian had difficulties relating to other people, and complaints about his behavior at the university began to accumulate. Some classmates described him as arrogant, condescending, and obsessive when interacting in classes or academic discussions. By the end of 2022, Brian was going through personal and work-related problems. The young man was studying criminology and had been appointed as a teaching assistant. However, complaints began to accumulate related to his behavior, especially towards women. Shortly after, he ended up being dismissed from his academic position. Days before Christmas, Brian embarked on a long car trip to Pennsylvania with his father. During the journey, they were stopped twice by traffic officers while driving their white Hyundai, once for speeding and another for driving too close to a truck. Brian appeared calm and cooperative during both stops, without imagining that the authorities were already starting to focus on vehicles exactly like his. The detectives also discovered that Brian had changed the plates on his car a few days after the crimes. Finally, on December 30th, 2022, the authorities carried out an intense operation at the family home and arrested Brian. During the raid, they seized gloves, a mask, a bladed weapon, a firearm, electronic devices, hair, and various objects considered relevant to the investigation. Additionally, Brian's cell phone records repeatedly placed him near the area where the attacks occurred. Even so, he denied any involvement in the crime and offered a vague alibi, claiming that he had simply been driving around the area that early morning. On January 4, 2023, Brian Koberger was extradited to Idaho and formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and burglary. His arrival generated enormous media attention as authorities began to reveal some of the evidence gathered against him. So the investigators were convinced that Brian had watched the King Road house for weeks before the attack. Doubts also began to arise about a possible obsession with some of the victims, especially Kaylee and Madison. It was reported that photographs of Kaylee and records related to her social networks were found on the accused's phone. Meanwhile, more details about Brian's personality became known. On a social media account, he described himself as a criminologist interested in studying the human experience. At the same time, former acquaintances began to speak publicly about his strange behaviors, obsessions, and difficulties in socializing. Meanwhile, the families of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan were trying to cope with the emotional impact as the case slowly moved toward trial. The university held ceremonies and tributes to remember the young people whose names had already become a symbol of one of the most shocking tragedies in the country's recent history. But as public pressure grew, there remained a question that no one could fully answer. Why had Brian committed such a brutal crime? Until that moment, the authorities still had not found a clear connection between him and the victims. As the judicial process advanced, more details began to emerge about Brian's life and thoughts. Investigators and journalists found old posts made by him on internet forums where he spoke openly about emotional problems, social disconnection, and disturbing thoughts related to his perception of reality. In several of these messages, Brian described feeling empty, unable to experience normal emotions, and observing his own life as if he were detached from it. He also mentioned suffering from mental health issues and talked about a visual disorder known as visual snow, which made him perceive dots similar to static in front of his eyes. Although he used a different name on those forums, various details allowed the posts to be linked to him. Among them were his date of birth, personal references, and an email address previously linked to Brian. Several people who knew him claimed that the comments matched his behavior during adolescence and youth. Meanwhile, former classmates and acquaintances began to publicly describe him as intelligent but also awkward and arrogant in his personal relationships. Some claimed that he had difficulty accepting criticism and could behave particularly intensely with women. Meanwhile, the prosecution officially announced that it would seek the death penalty if Brian were found guilty. The decision further increased media attention on the trial, which was already being followed nationwide. Brian, for his part, remained almost always expressionless during the hearings, silently listening to the descriptions of the attacks made by the prosecutors. Despite the enormous amount of evidence gathered, many questions remained unanswered. The investigators still could not clearly establish why Brian chose those victims or what exact motivation led him to commit the crime. As the case slowly moved toward trial, the families of Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan continued to face the emotional consequences of the tragedy. The parents of the victims began to publicly share their pain and the difficulties they faced in continuing with their lives after the attacks. Madison's mother confessed that she constantly dreamed of her daughter and that the hardest part was waking up and remembering the reality again. Ethan's parents spoke about the void their son left within the family, while Kaylee's mother stated that the conditions in which they found her daughter showed that she practically had no chance to escape. Meanwhile, the survivors Dylan and Bethany tried to stay away from public attention while continuing to deal with the trauma of having survived that early morning. The media pressure around the case remained enormous, and any news generated immediate repercussions throughout the country. At the end of 2023, the house on King Road was demolished. For many residents, that house had become a permanent symbol of the horror experienced by the university community. Sometime later, the University of Idaho inaugurated a memorial garden and various scholarships in honor of the victims. The trial against Brian had been scheduled for August of 2025. However, in July of that same year, an unexpected turn occurred. Brian agreed to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. The agreement surprised several of the families, especially because it did not require the accused to explain his motives or reveal details about what happened. The decision caused divided opinions among the victims' families. Some considered that the agreement avoided years of appeals and an extremely painful trial. Others, however, felt that they would never get the answers they had been waiting for years about why their children were attacked in such a brutal way. During the final hearings of the case, the prosecutors revealed new details about how Brian allegedly carried out the attacks. According to the official reconstruction, he entered the house shortly after 4 in the morning using the sliding kitchen door. Dressed in black and wearing a balaclava, he first went up to the 3rd floor, where he attacked Madison and Kaylee. Authorities also confirmed that Brian accidentally left the knife sheath next to Madison's body, a mistake that ended up becoming one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation. After the attack on the 3rd floor, Zana came face to face with him while she was still awake after receiving a food delivery. Then, Brian also attacked Ethan. Another shocking revelation was that, according to the prosecution, hours after the attacks, Brian took a selfie giving a thumbs-up gesture. Furthermore, the authorities confirmed that the murder weapon was never found. The final sentencing hearing was held on July 23, 2025. For more than 3 hours, family members and survivors publicly confronted Brian in the courtroom. Kaylee's mother called him a failure and assured him that he would be forgotten for the rest of his life in prison. In one of the most emotional moments, Dylan spoke publicly for the first time about the impact the attacks had on his life. Through tears, he remembered Kaylee, Madison, Zana, and Ethan as people full of light and stated that Brian had taken away the chance to tell them how much he loved them again. Despite all the testimonies, Brian remained cold and expressionless. When the judge offered him the opportunity to speak, he simply replied that he preferred not to. Finally, he was sentenced to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Hours later, the police released hundreds of documents related to the investigation that helped solve one of the most shocking and terrifying crimes in recent United States history. The case of Brian Koberger left a feeling of emptiness and helplessness that is hard to ignore. 4 young university students were attacked in a brutal manner inside a home that was supposed to represent safety, while the perpetrator managed to continue with his routine for weeks, pretending normalcy. It is unsettling to think that someone with advanced studies in criminology, specifically interested in understanding the criminal mind, ended up becoming the protagonist of one of the most terrifying massacres in recent years. And even more disturbing is that even after pleading guilty, he never really explained why he did it. There also remains the bitter feeling that many questions will never be answered. The families had to accept a plea deal that avoided the death penalty, but at the same time left the exact motives behind the attack unclear. Was there really an obsession with any of the victims? Why did he decide to enter that particular house? How could someone commit such an atrocity and remain completely cold throughout the process? Brian Koberger's final silence ended up becoming another form of punishment for those still trying to understand a tragedy impossible to comprehend.
I read you in the comments.
And well, dear audience, that's another investigation. What do you think about today's case? We would love to read your comments, as your opinion on the cases is very important to us. Always remember to do so with the utmost respect possible, both for the victim and for the other viewers and us who will be reading them. Before you leave, give us a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Also, don't forget to share this video if you think someone you know might be interested. See you in another criminal investigation. Goodbye.